Hey everybody, and welcome to week 8 of class. Wow, we are really getting along here. So we are up to going over chapters 10 and 11 this week, which we'll talk about in just one moment. I think the tests came in. You got pretty good results. I will tell you that if you felt like you didn't do as well as I would have liked to have done on that particular test, that's one of the reasons I offer that optional final test, which covers the last chapters in the class, and it's actually listed as extra credit. So you really can't go wrong taking that test. So if you didn't do as well on this one, take that final one. It will allow you to gain points without them, without them adding up as a total to your. Well, they will add up to your grade, but it doesn't add anything to the denominator of it, which is essentially what a test would do. So it's all extra credit, and so it's a way for you to boost your grade at the end. The best thing I can tell you about the first test is you only have to take it once. I mean, there's only one first test in every class, so that's the good news. I understand. Sometimes you don't really you don't know what to expect when you go to take the test. And as much as you think you're preparing for it, you get caught by surprise. It's not exactly what you were expecting, and it happens. So that's why, again, I offer that final test so that you have that opportunity to make up for what you would have wished you did a little bit better on. But on the whole, I thought people did actually pretty well on that test. Okay, so moving onward and upward, we're going on to be looking at chapters 10 and 11. One thing I want to point out is I actually realized I put the wrong week for spring break. It doesn't really change anything in terms of the schedule of the class, except it just flip-flops the weeks that I had in the original schedule. So I know next week is spring break, and have fun, go crazy, do whatever it is you're going to do. If you're like me, you're just going to work and it doesn't matter. So if you come back with a really nice suntan, good for you. Please don't brag on it because I won't have one. I'm just kidding. That's just, that's spring break. So, but enjoy it though, one way or another. Okay, so let's talk about chapters 10 and 11. Last week we looked at a really important foundational concept, which is the time value of money as it relates to how we look at finance. This week, in Chapter 10, we're going to talk about valuation and rates of return, basically on assets, financial assets that the organization has. So, how do we value those? How do we take a look at what that means to the firm? So, that's really what we're going to cover this week. And actually 10 and 11 are actually fairly closely related because chapter 11 essentially looks at, okay, well, what does that represent in terms of a cost to an organization? So this is just coming up with a valuation of the assets. Chapter 11, we're going to be talking about the costs associated with those. Okay, so your learning objectives for this week with chapter 10 are: know the valuation of a financial asset is based on the present value of future cash flows. Just kind of a basic tenet of finance. You'll see that repeated quite often. You want to recognize that the required rate of return in valuing an asset is based on the risk involved. That's a very important foundational concept as well, the required rate of return. And that has to be used to value an asset and understand what we should expect from it. Okay. Recall that bond valuation, we're going to talk about bonds specifically, is based on the process of determining the present value of interest payments plus the present value of the principal payment at maturity. Important thing to kind of take into account, not only from from the offerer or the but also for the investor. What are they looking at and what do they expect? You want to be able to explain the basis of preferred stock valuation, which is kind of an important concept in finance, just to help you understand, what preferred stocks are and how they are valued. And then a little more broader view of how stock valuation is also determined. So these are really important concepts that you need to take away because They're kind of the basis for making decisions on how you're going to fund the organization ongoing. So take a good look at that. That's Chapter 10. Let's take a look at Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, in a sense, we're looking at the flip side of it from what we looked at in Chapter 10, is that determines how to value those assets, but now you have to think about what does that mean from the perspective of a cost to the organization, and how that should be evaluated as well. So in Chapter 11, we're going to, you want to be able to remember that the cost of capital represents the weighted average cost of the source of financing to the firm. And that will make sense when you read about it, but, clearly organizations don't use one particular source of raising capital. So the total cost of capital is looking at it from an average weighted cost. Understand that the cost of capital is normally the discount rate to use in analyzing an investment. Again, there's that concept of the discount rate and how that's actually determined and how it's used. We want to recognize that the cost of capital is based on the valuation techniques from the previous chapter and is applied to bonds, preferred stock, and common stock. So again, what the valuation technique determines ultimately reflects the cost of that capital to the organization. We want to explain how a firm attempts to find a minimum cost of capital through varying the mix of its sources and financing. That's essentially what financial management's about. You're looking for the most opportune ways to generate capital at the most minimal cost. And then recall that the cost of capital may eventually increase as larger amounts of financing are utilized, which tends to make sense. If you have any question about that, look at what the city of Chicago is up against these days in trying to issue debt in the form of bonds. They have a much harder road in front of them now, certainly based on the amount of debt that's already there. So anyway, those are just ways to consider what the cost of capital is. Very important too, I'm going to say, even if you're not in the financial management, you need to understand what the cost of capital is when you're considering managerial projects. Things that say, look, I want to grow the business by doing this, but I'm going to need some capital to do it. Well, the cost of capital becomes a very important determination, and whether or not that's a good idea or not. So anyway, it's an important. These are important concepts you want to take away, whether you have a career in finance or not. All right. So if you have any questions about it, certainly let me know. And the best of luck. And again, if you have any questions on the assignments, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.